picture this. It's July 2009. You're sitting in a dark theater, halfway through a movie you figured was going to be another disposable evil child thriller. You've seen the type. Creepy kid, oblivious parents, mounting chaos, messy climax, roll credits. You've already clocked the warning signs in this one, the ribbons around the little girl's wrists, the paintings that feel too precise for a 9-year-old, the way she watches adults with something that isn't quite innocence, but isn't quite anything you can name either. You're comfortable. You think you got the shape of this thing. And then the movie does something to you. It tells you that Esther isn't a child. She's a 33-year-old woman named Lina Tlavat, a patient from the Sarne Institute in Estonia, a woman with hypopituitarism, a rare hormonal disorder that stunted her physical growth and permanently locked her body in the form of a child. She has been doing this for years, moving between families, killing when circumstances require it, seducing the husbands when she can. And absolutely none of that was on the poster. That moment hit 2009 audiences like a physical impact. Half the theater gasped. Some people laughed, not because it was funny, but because shock strips your defenses away in strange ways sometimes, and laughter is the nervous system's pressure valve. And in that split second, the entire movie you thought you understood completely rearranged itself inside your head. Every strange moment with Esther rewound at a different speed. Every knowing glance, every adult manipulation tactic, every scene of her studying John Coleman with that gaze that made you slightly, inexplicably uncomfortable. Suddenly, those things weren't the red flags of a disturbed child. They were signals from a predator who'd had decades of practice. That's the magic trick at the center of Orphan. And it's why we're here. This film has spent 15 years being considerably more interesting than a lot of people gave it credit for. When it dropped in summer 2009, it got lumped in with a wave of slick, mainstream horror that critics often filed under genre product. Competent enough craft, lurid premise, move along. The reviews were mixed. The cultural discourse around it was complicated, for reasons we'll dig into properly later. But the audience response told a different story. People showed up. They kept showing up. The film grossed just under 79 million worldwide against a 20 million budget, nearly 4 times its production cost, which in the horror game is what you call a decisive win. But here's what's interesting. The reason people kept coming back wasn't purely the twist, even though the twist is spectacular. It was because this movie does something genuinely tricky. It builds an entire functional thriller, a legitimately tense domestic horror film with real characters and real emotional stakes, and then reveals that the entire architecture of what you just watched was operating on 2 levels simultaneously. The surface horror was real. The deeper horror was realer. And both of them were telling you the truth the whole time. We're going to spend a lot of time inside this film. A serious amount of time, because there is a staggering amount to unpack. The performances, the craft, the editing rhythms, the way sound design works over time to tell you things the script is deliberately withholding. The very specific and deliberate way Jaume Colette Serra frames children in this movie. The cultural context around evil child horror as a subgenre. The real-world stories that fed into Alex Mace's original pitch. The casting process that found Isabel Fuhrman at 12 years old and handed her a dual performance that most adult actors would struggle to pull off. We are going to examine what this film is actually about beneath the visceral thriller mechanics, which includes, among other things, grief, marital fracture under compounding pressure, and the particular vulnerability of a woman whose credibility has been pre-eroded by her own history before the antagonist even arrives. There's a serious amount of movie here. Let's get into it. The origin story. The script for Orphan traces back to a concept pitched by writer Alex Mace that was, at its core, both structurally simple and genuinely disturbing at the level of pure premise. What if the worst thing an adoptive family could bring home wasn't a troubled child, but something that only looked like one? What if the threat wore the face of innocence so completely that every adult instinct to protect, nurture, and extend patience became a weapon that could be used against you? Mace's original story was developed into a screenplay by David Leslie Johnson, who has since gone on to write credits including Aquaman and The Conjuring 2. At the time though, this was a significant early career project, and what Johnson's script does, which often gets quietly overlooked in discussions of the film, is make a specific and sophisticated structural choice. It doesn't hide Esther's malevolence. From the first act, you know, more or less, that something is deeply and irrevocably wrong with this child. The mystery the film sustains across its runtime isn't, is Esther evil? That question is answered almost immediately. The mystery is, what is Esther? That distinction matters enormously for how the thriller mechanics function, because it shifts the dramatic irony from suspense to dread. You're not waiting to find out if something will go wrong. You're watching a family walking toward a cliff, and you cannot warn them. The project landed at Dark Castle Entertainment, the production shingle that had built a very specific niche for itself in mid-budget studio horror. House on Haunted Hill, Gothica, House of Wax. Joel Silver and Susan Downey produced What tends to get mentioned less is the involvement of Leonardo DiCaprio's production company, Appian Way, with DiCaprio and Jennifer Davison Killoran credited as producers alongside the Dark Castle team. Appian Way choosing to attach itself to a commercial horror project is a genuinely interesting production footnote. It suggests this premise attracted more serious industry investment than the film's eventual reputation as a mainstream genre piece would imply. The project also co-produced through Studio Babelsberg in Germany, which helped facilitate European locations that would prove essential to the backstory Colette Serra, constructed around Esther's past, and brought a specific architectural grimness to the production design. Warner Bros. Pictures distributed, which gave orphans something that many horror films at this budget level simply don't receive: a genuine wide release backed by real marketing infrastructure. That infamous tagline, "There's something wrong with Esther," became one of the cleaner pieces of horror marketing from the late 2000s. Minimal, insinuating. It told you precisely enough to generate curiosity while withholding everything that actually mattered. The poster leaned into an aesthetic that felt almost deliberately anachronistic. Esther in her old-fashioned dress, back to camera, standing in a snow-covered field, looking like a woodcut print of something that predated contemporary horror entirely. It visually separated the film from the grimy, desaturated aesthetic that had dominated mainstream horror throughout the mid-2000s torture porn era, and in doing so, signaled something different, something older, something that intended to disturb you on a different frequency. Guillaume Colette Serra. The director who shaped all of this was Jaime Colette Serra, a Spanish filmmaker who had arrived in Hollywood off his 2005 debut House of Wax. Yes, the one with Paris Hilton, but also a film that, if you watch it with your critical faculties engaged rather than your meme brain, demonstrates genuine technical confidence and a spatial intelligence that its reputation doesn't really credit. Colette Serra wasn't heading into Orphan, a filmmaker with a developed auteur brand or a particular aesthetic manifesto. What he was, and this was arguably more useful for this specific project, was supremely technically capable, with clear visual instincts and no fat whatsoever in his editing rhythms. What Colette Serra brings to Orphan is, paradoxically, restraint, which might sound odd for a film with this level of operatic premise. But sit with the film carefully and you'll notice that the most genuinely unsettling sequences are the quiet ones. He holds shots a bit longer than comfortable. He frames Esther using compositional registers and focal lengths associated with adult characters in dramatic films, placing her in frames that suggest psychological agency and spatial dominance, while simultaneously positioning her against environments that emphasize her physical smallness. The cognitive dissonance this creates operates on your nervous system, even when the surface-level narrative tension is technically low. You're uneasy before you have language for why. This was also a film that required Colette Serra to navigate legitimately delicate production territory. You have child actors performing scenes of significant psychological and physical intensity. You have a role that requires a 12-year-old to convincingly portray the predatory behavior and emotional register of an adult. The way the film handles those demands and the genuine questions that arise about exactly where it pushes into uncomfortable creative territory is something we'll examine in depth during the performance analysis section. At the production level, though, Colette Serra has spoken about the deliberate care taken to maintain professional distance from the emotional weight of the material for the younger cast, ensuring they understood they were executing craft rather than personally inhabiting the darker dimensions of the story. Orphan was, in many ways, the film that set Colette Serra's professional identity. He would go on to build a long, productive, collaborative relationship with Liam Neeson, Unknown, Non-Stop, Run All Night, The Commuter, before landing larger-scale work in Jungle Cruise and Black Adam. But the formal qualities that make those films work, propulsive editing, genuine architectural spatial awareness in action sequences, an ability to escalate tension within enclosed environments, those were qualities he was actively developing and refining here. Casting the impossible role. And then there's Isabelle Fuhrman. Here's the thing about casting Esther. This role should not be casting Esther. This role should not be casting Esther. This role should not be castable. On paper, you are asking a child actor to carry the entire weight of a horror film's menace, while simultaneously maintaining a convincing surface facade of charm and innocence, executing scenes of cold psychological manipulation that would challenge adult performers, and then, when the mask finally drops, delivering the kind of predatory adult energy that makes an audience genuinely afraid. This isn't a child performance. This is a shape-shifting dual performance that just happens to be housed in the body of a 12-year-old. Fuhrman was reportedly among several young actresses who auditioned, and the film's production has noted that multiple candidates were considered across the range of evil child roles being cast around this same period, including Case 39, another horror project from approximately the same window. What Fuhrman brought to the room and what absolutely blazes off the screen in the finished film is an almost eerie emotional composure that she can switch from warmth to calculation to full violence with barely a visible seam in between. 12 years old. The range she demonstrates across this film, from the sculpted sweetness of Esther's public presentation to the terrifying competence of her private cruelty, sits comfortably among the genuinely remarkable child performances in the history of the genre. Vera Farmiga brought considerable dramatic credibility to Kate Coleman. An Oscar-nominated actress with serious dramatic range, Farmiga grounds what could easily become an hysterical protagonist and plays Kate's escalating unraveling with surgical specificity. Peter Sarsgaard plays John Coleman in a register that frustrates many viewers on first watch. Passively, sympathetically obtuse, but that passivity is doing very specific structural work in the narrative that we'll unpack properly. CCH Pounder appears as Sister Abigail, the nun from the orphanage who carries warnings nobody wants to hear and whose scenes function as the film's compressed Greek chorus. Margot Martindale plays Dr. Alice Browning, Kate's therapist. And Jimmy Bennett as Daniel and Ariana Engineer as the deaf daughter Max both deliver considerably more than the script strictly requires of them. Engineer, who is herself hearing impaired, brings a lived authenticity to Max that transforms what could have been a plot mechanism character into someone the audience actually invests in. The film shot primarily in Canada, with the Canadian winter serving as Connecticut and some European material to establish the institutional architecture of Esther's background. The production design. A house that is objectively beautiful and deeply cold, all clean lines and winter light and expensive surfaces. Thus, continuous atmospheric work throughout the film. There is something deliberate and intelligent about setting a story about the corruption of domestic idealism inside a home that looks like a magazine spread. But the house, the cast, the director, the twist that hasn't landed yet in theaters, none of it means anything without the story itself. And often is, underneath its marketing as a shock delivery device, a more carefully engineered thriller than it typically receives credit for. So let's walk into the Coleman family's world and let's understand exactly what this film built. Because the only way to fully appreciate why that final revelation works is to understand precisely what was constructed in the 90 minutes before it arrived. Before Esther ever walks through the front door, often does something that a lot of horror films skip entirely. It spends real time making you care about the family she's going to destroy. The opening sequence is brutal, not in a jump scare sense, in an emotional sense. Kate Coleman is in labor, and something has gone catastrophically wrong. The film doesn't ease you in. It opens on fluorescent hospital light, the antiseptic panic of a delivery room, and Vera Farmiga performing the specific, gutting anguish of a woman who has lost a baby she had already named, already imagined, already loved. The baby's name was Jessica. She was stillborn, and the film lingers in this moment. The hollow silence after the machines stop being urgent, the strange bureaucratic gentleness of hospital staff who are trained to handle this kind of devastation. The way John holds Kate with the helpless tenderness of someone who wants to fix something that cannot be fixed. That's your first 30 seconds. Most genre films would file this under establishing backstory and move on. Colette Serra lets it breathe. Because everything that follows, every decision Kate makes, every vulnerability Esther finds and presses, every moment when John doesn't quite believe his wife, is downstream from this room. The Colemans are a family that has survived a profound loss and is still, 18 months later, carrying it in their bodies. The decision to adopt is born from that grief, which means it is also unavoidably weighted with grief's complicated logic. Kate wants to fill the space that Jessica left. John wants to make Kate whole again. Neither of them is adopting from a purely settled, arrived at peace motivation. They are hoping that love can do the work of grief. That is not a stable foundation. K.K. Coleman. Specifically, let's talk about Kate. Because she is the character who carries the full thematic and emotional architecture of this film, and she deserves examination that goes beyond the mom who figures it out. Kate is a former alcoholic. She's been sober for some stretch of time, long enough that John believes she's arrived somewhere stable, not long enough that she believes it herself. She has a therapist she sees regularly, Dr. Browning, played by Margot Martindale, which tells you something important. Kate is a person who is actively working on herself, actively maintaining the structure required to stay functional. She is not the reckless, irresponsible figure that her history might suggest to someone encountering her secondhand. But her history exists. It is documented. It is, in the specific social world of the film, known. And this matters enormously for how the film's horror operates, because Esther doesn't simply threaten the Coleman family with violence. She wages a campaign that specifically targets Kate's credibility. From the very early stages of Esther's manipulation, the tactics are calibrated to make Kate appear unstable, paranoid, emotionally volatile, to position her as a woman whose concerns about the new child should be weighed against her documented psychological history rather than taken at face value. The ribbons around Esther's wrists aren't just aesthetic oddities, they become evidence in an argument. Sister Abigail's death isn't just a horror set piece, it's Esther removing the one external witness who could corroborate Kate's instincts before Kate has developed sufficient internal credibility to be believed without corroboration. This is sophisticated. This is not a child antagonist throwing tantrums and breaking things. This is a character with the psychological toolkit of someone who has spent years observing how adults undermine other adults. Specifically, how the social architecture around women with mental health histories can be weaponized against them. Whether or not the film fully intends this reading, it functions as an extremely pointed narrative about the conditions under which women stop being believed. Kate's descent into the second act, where she becomes increasingly frantic while the world around her increasingly attributes that frenzy to internal instability rather than genuine external threat, maps precisely onto real-world dynamics in which women raising concerns are reframed as the problem rather than the alarm. Vera Farmiga plays all of this with a precision that should have generated significantly more awards conversation than it did. The challenge she faces is keeping Kate sympathetic and coherent, even as the script requires her to make decisions that will frustrate some viewers. She needs you to believe in Kate's lucidity while the film is structurally engineering your doubt. That is a technical performance challenge of genuine complexity, and Farmiga navigates it by anchoring every scene in Kate's body. The tension in her jaw, the way she holds her breath before speaking, the physical cost of maintaining composure under mounting pressure. You never lose the sense that this is a woman who is not imagining things, even when the film is working to make you question her. John Coleman, The Blind Spot. Peter Sarsgaard's performance as John Coleman has been a point of frustration for viewers since 2009. Too passive, some say. Too oblivious. Refuses to connect the dots that are practically numbered and color-coded in front of him. Here's what I think is actually happening with John. He is a man who has decided, on some level, that maintaining family equilibrium is his primary function. Not investigation, not skepticism, not confronting uncomfortable possibilities. Equilibrium. The stillbirth broke something between him and Kate. The adoption was supposed to be the repair. John cannot process the idea that the repair might be the next catastrophe because that thought leads somewhere he is not equipped to go. Sarsgaard plays this with a specific, deliberate blankness that some viewers read as bad acting, and I'd argue is exact characterization. John isn't stupid, he's willfully unseeing, which is an entirely different thing and a far more recognizable human quality. Watch him in the scenes where Kate raises concerns about Esther. There's a specific micro-expression. Sarsgaard deploys a subtle flattening of his features, a measured carefulness that isn't actually listening but is performing listening. John has already decided what story he's living in. Kate's concerns are a disruption to that story rather than data points in a separate, truer story. And here's where Esther is genuinely terrifying in her intelligence. She reads John correctly within days of arriving. She understands with that uncanny precision that comes from decades of observation and iteration exactly what John needs from a surrogate-daughter relationship. She gives it to him. The painting sessions, the quiet evenings, the way she learns his rhythms and accommodates them. She is building a counter-narrative that John will choose over Kate's narrative when the moment of forced choice arrives. Because John, structurally, cannot afford for Kate to be right. Daniel and Max, the Coleman children, function very differently from each other, and the film is smarter about this distinction than it often gets credit for. Daniel, played by Jimmy Bennett, who had already established himself as a reliable young actor in films including Star Trek 2009, where he played young James Kirk, is a preteen operating from pure instinct. He doesn't like Esther from the first moment, and he doesn't have the social conditioning yet that teaches you to override your instincts in the service of politeness or family harmony. His antagonism toward Esther is raw and honest, and from the audience's perspective, entirely correct. But being entirely correct doesn't protect him. This is one of the more quietly unnerving dimensions of the film. The character who sees the situation most clearly is also the most vulnerable, because his clarity makes him Esther's most immediate obstacle. Max is a different matter. Ariana Engineer's portrayal of the deaf youngest Coleman is one of the film's genuinely underappreciated elements. Max is drawn to Esther in the way that small children can be drawn to other people who feel slightly outside the normal social world. There's a recognition there, an affinity between two people who navigate an environment designed for someone slightly other than themselves. Esther exploits this mercilessly. The scenes between Esther and Max carry a genuine manipulative tenderness. Esther is not performing warmth toward Max the way she performs it toward the adults. She's doing something more calculated. She's creating genuine attachment so that Max will become both an instrument and a hostage. Engineer, who was born hard of hearing and uses hearing aids, brought an authenticity to Max's communication and behavioral patterns that elevates the role considerably above Sweet Mute Child in Peril. The way Max navigates spaces, the specific quality of her attention and awareness, the physical expressiveness she develops in place of the dialogue that other child characters receive, these are not approximations. This is lived in physicality. And in a film that is largely about the manipulation of appearances, having one character whose communication exists outside the main channels through which Esther operates creates a fascinating asymmetry. Max is both uniquely vulnerable to Esther and, in a particular way, uniquely unmanipulable because the systems Esther has mastered aren't the ones Max primarily uses. The Sarni Institute and the world outside the frame. There's a geography to Orphan that exists beyond what the camera shows us. Estonia. The Sarni Institute. Lena Clauvert. Before any of that is revealed, the film plants it in scattered fragments. The way Esther speaks with the occasional trace of something that doesn't quite fit her stated background. The formal precision of her mannerisms that feels cultured rather than American suburban. The religious iconography in her artwork that has an older Eastern European quality to it. What's impressive about the script's construction is that these details don't read as clues when you first encounter them. They read as texture, as the interesting specificity of an unusual child from an unusual background. It's only on a second viewing that you realize how thoroughly the film was encoding its secret. Esther's backstory isn't a late-game invention retrofitted to justify a twist. It's distributed through the entire film in elements that were always consistent with the revelation. We just didn't have the interpretive frame to read them correctly. The Sarne Institute, when it finally surfaces in Kate's research, is described as a facility for the criminally insane, not a children's home, not a residential treatment center, a psychiatric institution for adults deemed dangerous. The photographic evidence Kate finds, an adult woman, clearly Esther, staring out of an institutional photo with an expression that makes your blood do something unpleasant, lands with such impact precisely because the film has earned it. Every weird moment rewrites. Every uncomfortable scene reveals its other dimension. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning of Esther's time with the Colemans. Let's watch how the con starts. Because the con, like all good cons, starts with something that looks exactly like hope. The Colemans visit the Meadowbrook Children's Home and meet Sister Abigail, CCH founder, radiating a particular institutional authority that manages to be simultaneously comforting and guarded. The orphanage is shot in a way that isn't grotesquely bleak. It's not a Dickensian horror show, not trying to make adoption itself seem threatening. It's simply a place of managed melancholy, children in transit between one configuration of family and another. The staff navigating the emotional complexity of helping connections form while managing the risk of connections that don't work. And in the middle of a room, painting, is Esther. It's a beautifully constructed introduction. She doesn't turn immediately. The camera approaches her from behind. A choice, call it. Sarah will repeat at key moments throughout the film, always emphasizing the back of Esther's head, the refusal of full visibility, the suggestion that you are never quite seeing the whole face. When she does turn, it's with a composure that sits just slightly off the register of normal child behavior. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggers your alarm bells, but in a way that you might file under, "This is a very self-possessed kid," rather than "This is a predator assessing me." She shows Kate her paintings. They're extraordinary. Too extraordinary. But nobody says that. Nobody says the quiet part out loud. Because the quiet part, "Children don't paint like this," is overridden by the social imperative to reward what looks like talent, to encourage what looks like sensitivity, to embrace what looks like the beginning of connection. The Colemans take Esther home, and the clock starts ticking. The early days of Esther's time with the Colemans are the film's most technically sophisticated section, and they don't get nearly enough credit for it. What Colette Serra is doing in this stretch, roughly the first 30 minutes after Esther's arrival at the house, is executing a specific and genuinely difficult tonal balancing act. He needs to establish Esther as a threat that the audience can feel without making that threat so legible that the family's failure to perceive it becomes implausible, too obvious, and the Colemans look like idiots, too subtle, and the audience's unease never properly ignites. The film finds a third register. Esther behaves in ways that are unusual, even troubling, but always within the range that a reasonable adult could attribute to adjustment difficulties, to the specific wounds of institutional childhood, to the strangeness of being a child nobody has wanted for long enough. Watch the dinner table scene. Esther sits with perfect posture, and I mean perfect, the kind of postural correctness that reads as training rather than habit. She speaks in complete formal sentences. She says "please" and "thank you" with a slight emphasis that suggests the words are being deployed rather than used automatically, the way a person learning a language speaks with a little more deliberateness than a native speaker. None of this is alarming on its own. Unusual, yes. The kind of thing a new parent might find charming. "Oh, she's so polite, so well-spoken for her age." But it accumulates. Frame by frame, scene by scene, the formal precision stacks up into something that feels less like a child and more like a very good performance of one. The ribbons around her wrists are present from the very first scene. Esther explains them, when asked, as protecting scars from a fire at a previous foster home. It's a plausible explanation, delivered with a practiced catch in the voice, not so much emotion that it demands sympathy, just enough to close the inquiry. Kate accepts this. John accepts this. The audience accepts this. And then, for the next hour, those ribbons become one of the film's most effective recurring visual cues. They're always there. They're always just slightly too deliberate in how they're worn. You keep coming back to them without knowing why, until you do. First, fractures. Esther's first real act of violence in the film is not directed at a person, it's directed at a bird. There's a moment, brief, almost throwaway in its staging, where Esther encounters an injured bird near the Coleman property. Max finds it first, with the gentle curiosity of a child drawn to wounded things. And Esther, after a beat, kills it, not in a dramatic way, efficiently, quietly, with a rock and a steadiness that has no effect attached to it whatsoever. She tells Max it was a mercy killing, that the bird was suffering, that she was helping it. She says it gently, she says it calmly. Max, who cannot hear but can absolutely read faces, watches Esther say this. And there's something in engineer's performance in this beat, a particular stillness, a processing that tells you Max filed something away, not a conscious suspicion. More like a sensory note that the body takes before the mind catches up with it. The scene is maybe 40 seconds long and it is doing an enormous amount of work. This is Esther establishing a pattern she'll use throughout the film, framing violence as logic, as compassion, as the correct response to a problem that others are too sentimental to solve efficiently. It's a worldview, not an impulse. And it's a worldview she's had long enough to have built an entire ethical language around it. When she kills the bird, she isn't being cruel. She's demonstrating to herself as much as to Max that she's a person who does what needs doing. Sister, Abigail's warning. CCH Pounder gets one great scene in Orphan and she absolutely detonates it. Sister Abigail comes to check on Esther's adjustment, a standard welfare visit, routine in both procedure and tone. But over the course of her conversation with Kate, something shifts. The sister has been reviewing records. She has been, in the careful institutional language she uses, revisiting certain details. The film doesn't spell out exactly what she knows or suspects, but Pounder plays the scene with a controlled urgency that communicates volumes. This woman has seen something in a file, or received a call, or put together a pattern, and she is trying to communicate it through the specific minefield of official propriety, legal protocol, and the fear of saying something defamatory about a child. What the scene does brilliantly is demonstrate the institutional barriers that can exist between someone who has relevant information and the person who needs it. Sister Abigail doesn't simply say, "I think Esther is dangerous, here's why." She can't, or believes she can't. She speaks in careful hedges. She recommends additional monitoring. She suggests Kate remain observant. She is trying to hand Kate something without appearing to hand her something. And Kate, who is not yet at the point of active alarm, who is still in the early stage of adoption optimism, who has invested emotional labor into believing that this family configuration might work, doesn't fully receive what she is being given. And then, of course, Esther is in the room. She comes in quietly, the way she always comes in quietly. She greets Sister Abigail with her perfect composure. The nun's expression. In this moment, Pounder does something extraordinary with just the set of her face. A slight intensification of attention, a very small recalibration of her features, tells you everything. This woman is afraid of this child. She is professionally, personally, and fundamentally afraid of this specific 9-year-old, and she is managing that fear through extreme facial discipline. It's a small masterclass, and the scene pays off later in a way that isn't small at all. The greenhouse, one of the film's most genuinely effective horror set pieces, arrives relatively early, the greenhouse sequence, and it works because Colette Serra deploys his camera with an unusual restraint that makes the violence feel almost procedural. Two girls from Esther's school have been cruel to her in the way that children are cruel, thoughtlessly, performatively, in the group dynamic of the playground. One of them, Brenda, has been the primary instigator, the sort of child whose cruelty is social currency, deployed publicly to cement her status relative to a new, strange outsider. On its own, this is entirely recognizable, the ordinary social brutality of childhood. The film even allows you a beat of sympathy for Esther here. Nobody likes to watch a child be excluded and mocked, and Esther's face when she absorbs Brenda's contempt carries a quality that reads briefly as genuine hurt. Then Esther encounters Brenda alone. The actual violence happens partially off-screen, which is absolutely the right call. Colette Serra doesn't let you see the full extent of what Esther does. He gives you the setup, the isolation, the moment of attack beginning, and then he cuts to aftermath. What you don't see is more disturbing than what you do, because your imagination fills the gap with something calibrated to your own threshold for horror. What he does show you, Esther's face immediately before and during, is the precise moment when the facade drops. The careful, composed child's expression simply clears. What replaces it isn't rage, isn't panic, isn't the operatic wildness of movie villains. It's focus, cold, settled, purposeful focus, like something that has been waiting for an appropriate moment and has now identified one. This is the scene that properly establishes the film's register of horror, not the supernatural, not the operatic, the clinical, the family response. In the aftermath of the greenhouse, the film executes one of its most quietly sophisticated structural maneuvers. Esther returns home with blood on her coat. She explains it carefully, methodically, in terms that sound almost reasonable. Brenda had fallen. She had tried to help. She panicked and ran. The explanation has the quality of a prepared statement. It accounts for evidence. It anticipates questions. It positions Esther as a frightened child rather than a perpetrator. John accepts it instinctively. His reflex is protection, and Esther has already calibrated his reflex correctly. Kate doesn't accept it. But she can't prove the alternative. And more importantly, she can't fully articulate the alternative without sounding like what John is already, quietly, beginning to worry she might be, a woman whose anxiety is manufacturing threats. There is a conversation between Kate and John that night. Filmed in the bedroom, both of them in the practical, undramatic lighting of a real domestic space rather than the atmospheric gloom of a horror set, in which Kate tries to say something that John cannot let himself hear. Farmiga plays this moment with a very specific kind of emotional exhaustion, the fatigue of a person who is not being believed and knows that pressing harder will only make them appear less credible. She goes quiet. She goes to sleep or performs sleeping. That moment, Kate going quiet, deciding not to push, is the film's first major inflection point, because the only strategy that could have disrupted Esther's operation was external exposure. People believing Kate, people investigating, asking questions, connecting dots. Every time Kate retreats, every time she absorbs John's gentle skepticism and decides it isn't worth the fight, the window for conventional rescue narrows. And Esther, watching from somewhere, she's always watching, always in a doorway, or behind a corner, or just at the edge of frame, knows it. Daniel sees it. If Kate is the film's moral compass, and John is its structural blind spot, Daniel is its early warning system. And the film handles him with a directness that the adult characters never quite manage. Daniel doesn't dress up his suspicion in polite language. He doesn't try to articulate his unease through the frames of child psychology or family adjustment dynamics. He just knows, in the way that children can know things before they have theory to support the knowing, that something is wrong with this girl. His antagonism is reciprocated. Esther responds to Daniel's hostility with a particular precise coldness that she doesn't deploy toward adults, a quality that suggests he has been correctly assessed as both a threat and beneath the level of performance required to manage him. With adults, Esther acts. With Daniel, she barely bothers. This is one of the film's more terrifying implications. The elaborate performance, the ribbons, the formal manners, the perfect gratitude, the strategic vulnerability is for adults. It's for people who have been socialized to extend a child, the benefit of the doubt, who have built their identities around protection and nurturing, who have the most to lose by acknowledging that they've brought something dangerous into their home. Children who haven't acquired these specific social obligations see more clearly, and the film understands this in its bones. There's a scene where Daniel catches Esther in a lie, nothing dramatic, just a small inconsistency in her account of something trivial. The kind of lie that adults have learned to navigate with tact, to attribute to misremembering, to leave alone in the interest of social smoothness. Daniel, with the unceremonious directness of a 12-year-old, calls it out. Flat, no build-up. That's not true. Esther looks at him. It's maybe 2 seconds of screen time. The look contains something that the word calculation doesn't quite capture. It's more like a filing system being updated. Daniel Coleman, obstacle. Priority level, pending. Colette Serra holds on Fullman's face just long enough for you to register what you're seeing, and then the scene moves on. You carry that 2-second look with you through everything that follows. Max and the secret bond. The relationship between Esther and Max is the film's most morally complex thread, and it unfolds almost entirely in the margins, in background shots, in brief exchanges, in the sign language conversations between the two girls that the film's hearing characters cannot access. Esther learns Max's private sign language, not the formal ASL that Max uses with her family and teachers, but the specific invented shorthand that Max has developed, the private visual dialect between herself and the people she's closest to. The fact that Esther takes the time to learn this, to enter Max's private communicative space, this is, on its surface, a gesture of extraordinary warmth, of genuine effort, of the kind of attentiveness that a lonely child who has never quite been met on her own terms would experience as profound connection. It is, of course, also one of the most calculating things Esther does in the entire film. She isn't connecting with Max. She's acquiring a channel of communication that operates outside adult supervision. She's establishing a relationship of loyalty and shared secrecy that will make Max both an instrument of her plans and a living liability, a child who saw things, who knows things, who cannot easily articulate them through conventional channels without Esther's cooperation. Engineer carries the weight of this relationship with a quietness that keeps breaking your heart. Max loves Esther. Genuinely, uncomplicated, with the whole openness of a small child who has found a friend, who actually sees her. That love is real. It just happens to be love that's been engineered from the other side. And when the film eventually reaches the point where Max must confront what Esther actually is, that confrontation is devastating, partly because of the real affection that's been shattered, not just the illusion of it. The first act ends, roughly, with the Coleman family arriving at a new normal that is deeply abnormal and becoming more so by the week. Kate's unease is hardening into something she can't ignore. John's investment in the adoption narrative is calcifying into defensiveness. Daniel is openly hostile and increasingly isolated within his own home. Max is in Esther's pocket, emotionally and strategically. And Esther, having mapped every member of this family with a precision that would be admirable if it weren't so predatory, is preparing her next move. What's about to start is the second act, and it's where the film stops being a psychological slow burn and becomes something considerably more aggressive. The second act of Orphan is where the film earns its runtime. A lot of horror movies coast on premise through the middle. They establish the threat in Act 1. They repeat the threat's greatest hits in Act 2. They resolve the threat in Act 3, and they're done. Orphan doesn't do this. What it does instead is use the second act to fundamentally shift the terms of the horror. The first act was about dread, the creeping accumulation of wrongness that you couldn't yet articulate. The second act is about something harder, the systematic dismantling of a person's ability to be believed, while that person is simultaneously being correct about everything. That's not just horror, that's tragedy. And the film executes both simultaneously, which is the real source of its sustained power. Sister Abigail's exit. We need to talk about what happens to Sister Abigail, because it's the scene that formally announces the film's willingness to go places that mainstream studio horror in 2009 often flinched from. The Nun returns. She has clearly found something. Her behavior, the controlled urgency of her demeanor, tells you that whatever she was hedging around in her first visit has now become something she can no longer hedge around. She comes to the Coleman house with the specific purposefulness of someone who has made a decision about what they're going to say regardless of professional consequence. She is going to tell Kate the truth, or at least the portion of it she has access to. She doesn't get the chance. What happens to Sister Abigail is staged with a cold mechanical efficiency. That is, in retrospect, the film's clearest statement of what kind of villain Esther is. She isn't reactive. She doesn't panic. She doesn't improvise in the chaotic way of movie antagonists who've been cornered. The attack, when it comes, is preemptive and calibrated. Esther has assessed the threat. Sister Abigail represents, has identified the window and has acted within it before the window closes. What's disturbing isn't the violence itself, but the pre-violence composure, the moment just before, when Esther's face settles into that particular blankness we've seen once before, in the greenhouse. Decision made. Implementation beginning. CCH Pounder, to her considerable credit, plays Sister Abigail's final moments with a specific, awful clarity, not the operatic terror of horror movie victim conventions, but the grounded human fear of someone who realizes, too late, exactly what they're dealing with. There's no scream, there's a look. And the look contains an entire history of understated warning that nobody heard, arriving in the instant it can no longer matter. Colette Serra shoots the aftermath with that same restraint, no lingering, no exploitative emphasis. He gives you enough to register the gravity of what happened and then pulls back, because the more important story is what it means for Kate, who is now without her most credible external witness at precisely the moment she most needed one. Kate's isolation begins. This is the section of the film where Vera Farmiga does her heaviest lifting and where the horror becomes genuinely uncomfortable in ways that have nothing to do with violence. Kate is now operating in a specific and recognizable nightmare. She knows something is profoundly wrong. She has been right about it consistently, and her environment has been engineered, partly by Esther, partly by circumstance, partly by the accumulated history of her own vulnerabilities, to make her appear like the unreliable one. Her therapist listens with professional compassion and gentle skepticism. John loves her, but is clearly now mentally preparing contingency frameworks in which Kate's concerns are the problem that needs addressing rather than the child. The school finds no evidence of wrongdoing. The police investigation into Sister Abigail's death produces nothing that connects to Esther. Farmiga's genius in this section is the specific way she plays Kate's internal division. There's a part of Kate that hears the absence of external validation and begins involuntarily to wonder whether she's imagining things. Not because she believes it, but because she's a person who knows her own history and has been trained, partly through that history and partly through the social architecture of her world, to extend doubt to her own perceptions. The film makes you feel this division. There are moments when you see Kate hold a thought, weigh it, decide not to voice it. Not because she doesn't believe it, but because she is calculating how many chips of credibility she has left and whether this particular bet is worth the cost. This is psychological horror, and it's more unsettling than the violence. E as the social performance. The second act is also where we get to see Esther's social machinery operating at full capacity, and it is genuinely impressive to watch Furman modulate between registers in real time. The Esther that school sees is different from the Esther that home sees, which is different from the Esther that John sees, which is different from the Esther that Kate sees. Each performance is calibrated to its audience. With teachers, she is precociously earnest. The model student who asks questions that demonstrate not just intelligence but a charming eagerness to understand the world. With John, she is warm and a little fragile, leaving space for him to feel protective and needed. With Max, she is the older sister who finally gets her, present, patient, genuinely attentive in a way that costs her nothing because Max is already an asset. With Kate, she is careful, correct, slightly formal in a way that reads as wariness from a child who's been hurt before. That last mode is the most frightening of the four because it's the most active. With John, Esther is filling a role he's offering. With Kate, she's managing a threat. And managing Kate requires continuous real-time assessment, reading Kate's mood, adjusting the presentation, calculating the gap between what Kate suspects and what she can prove, never giving Kate anything solid to grip. When Kate pushes, Esther softens. When Kate backs off, Esther probes. When Kate tries to establish warmth, Esther receives it, with just enough reserve to keep Kate perpetually slightly off balance, reaching. Furman performs this with a technical precision that, again, 12 years old. I keep coming back to this because it matters. She isn't playing one character. She is playing 4 different performances of one character simultaneously and holding the underlying character beneath all 4 performances in a way that only the camera and only sometimes actually sees. It's a structurally layered performance that demands both the range to play each mode convincingly and the through-line intelligence to make them all recognizable as versions of the same architecture. The John problem deepens. John Coleman's function in the second act shifts from passive observer to active, if unconscious, enabler, and this shift is where the film's portrait of marital fracture becomes genuinely specific. The thing that keeps John from seeing Esther clearly is not stupidity. It's not even pure will to ignore, though that's part of it. It's something more recognizable and, in a way, more forgivable. John has made his love for Esther part of his recovery from grief, and questioning Esther now means questioning whether the recovery itself was built on something false. There is a particular kind of emotional investment that works exactly like sunk cost. The more you put in, the more impossible it becomes to acknowledge that what you invested in might be hollow. John has invested months of genuine fatherly tenderness into this relationship. To look at Kate's evidence, to take it seriously, means accepting that those months of tenderness were absorbed by something that had no capacity to genuinely receive them. That is a devastating thought, and John, consciously or not, refuses it. Sarsgaard plays the second act with a very specific edge of irritability underneath his measured reasonableness. John is not calm, he's managing. There is a scene where Kate comes to him with a specific, concrete concern. Something Esther said, something that doesn't add up, and John listens with that careful listening performance we noted earlier, and then says, with practiced gentleness, that he thinks Kate might be projecting, that the stress of everything they've been through has made her hypersensitive, that maybe she should talk to Dr. Browning about increasing their session frequency. The word projecting lands in the scene like a stone because it's clinical. It's the language of therapy, weaponized subtly, probably not consciously on John's part, to reframe Kate's legitimate observation as a symptom of Kate's pathology. And Kate's face in that moment, in Farmiga's hands, does something extraordinary. It goes very still. She receives the word. She processes what it means that John has just reached for that word. And then she says quietly, okay, and the scene ends. That okay is not agreement. That okay is a woman recalculating. Esther's first, direct. 3. There's a scene between Esther and Kate that happens outside the family's collective visibility, a direct, private conversation in which the pretense briefly drops just far enough for Kate to glimpse what's underneath, and then closes again before she has anything she can use. The scene is staged with great economy. It's a kitchen intellection, daylight, ordinary domestic setting. Kate says something, a specific challenge, a question designed to probe Esther's account of something, and Esther's response shifts register in a way that is almost imperceptible unless you're already watching for it. She doesn't threaten, she doesn't reveal. She does something more disturbing. She says something that has 2 complete and simultaneous meanings. On its surface, the meaning is innocent, a child expressing mild confusion at a misunderstanding. Underneath the surface, in the subtext that Esther is delivering with complete precision, the meaning is a warning. She is telling Kate, without telling Kate anything she could repeat to anyone, that she knows exactly what Kate suspects, that she is not afraid of it, and that Kate should consider carefully what she plans to do next. And then she asks if she can have a glass of milk. The banality of that request, arriving immediately after the double-layered warning, is the scariest thing in the scene, because it tells you that this was nothing, a passing note, Esther filing a small piece of information while conducting the rest of her life at full functionality. Kate scared her? No. Kate registered as a variable requiring brief management. And management is now complete. Milk, please. Farmiga plays the aftermath of this exchange as Esther leaves the room and Kate is left alone with a very specific kind of horror that doesn't involve screaming or fleeing. She grips the counter, she breathes. She is assembling from the scattered pieces of everything she's observed and felt and been unable to prove the shape of something she doesn't fully have language for yet. Something wrong is in this house. Something wrong is wearing her daughter's face, and she's alone with the knowledge of it. Daniel's escalating danger. Daniel's storyline in the second act traces a trajectory from instinctive hostility to active investigation to very real physical danger, and the film handles this escalation with a restraint that makes it more effective rather than less. He starts poking at the edges of Esther's facade, small acts of defiance and exposure, confronting her about inconsistencies, once following her in a way that almost tells him more than he was prepared to find out. The film uses Daniel to demonstrate the specific danger of being right without sufficient protection. He is the most accurate reader of the situation in the family and therefore, structurally, the most immediately threatening to Esther's operation. He is also 12, lacking the credibility, the resources, and the adult infrastructure required to turn correct suspicion into actionable proof. What happens to Daniel? The escalation of Esther's campaign against him, from cold antagonism to something considerably more dangerous, is staged with a brutality that the film earns rather than sensationalizes. The moments of genuine violence arrive not as set pieces, but as the logical extension of everything we watched building. Esther doesn't attack Daniel out of rage. She manages the Daniel problem with the same cold procedure she applied to Sister Abigail. Assessment, decision, implementation, and the horror of it is exactly that procedural quality. She doesn't hate Daniel. She is simply resolving an obstacle. Jimmy Bennett brings a specific, unguarded quality to these scenes that keeps Daniel from becoming merely a victim function. He's a kid trying to protect his family with the tools available to a kid, which is to say, inadequate tools, and the film honors the genuine courage of that inadequacy rather than making it look foolish. He's not stupid, he's outmatched. There is a real difference. By the midpoint of Act 2, the Coleman household has reached a specific and horrible equilibrium. Kate is increasingly certain, increasingly isolated, and increasingly aware that conventional systems, the therapist, the school, the police, John, will not protect this family. Daniel is in danger. He can feel but not fully articulate. Max is enmeshed in a relationship whose true nature she doesn't understand. John is retreating deeper into the comfort of his preferred narrative. And Esther, having neutralized the most dangerous external witness, having established her credit with John, having secured Max as both ally and leverage, Esther is ready to escalate. The second half of Act 2 is where Orphan stops being careful about how much it reveals. It's about to show you exactly what Lena Cloward is capable of when the patient work of installation is complete and the situation requires something more direct. Here's something the film does that most horror movies don't. It gives Esther a motive that makes structural sense, not moral sense. Let's be clear about that. Nothing Esther does is justifiable. But the film is careful to construct her psychology in a way that has internal coherence, rather than the arbitrary malevolence of pure genre evil. Lena Clower has spent most of her adult life trapped in a biological paradox. Her body never developed past childhood. Every attempt she has made to live as an adult, to be recognized as an adult, to form adult relationships, to occupy adult space has collided with the physical reality that she looks like a 9-year-old girl. The institutions that housed her didn't see a woman. They saw a disturbed child. The families that took her in didn't see a person with adult needs and adult history. They saw a project. The Sarne Institute didn't treat her as a patient with complex adult psychology. They contained her. And what you are when you are contained long enough, when every attempt to assert your actual identity is met with disbelief or clinical pathologizing. What you become is precisely what Lena became, a person who has learned to weaponize the perception others insist on having of you. She is not playing a child. She is using the child shape she cannot escape as the most efficient available tool. That distinction between performance as strategy and performance as survival gives Esther a depth that the film earns and then uses effectively in the second half of Act 2, where the strategy starts to fray at the edges in ways that Esther cannot fully control. The Erebion removal scene. There is a sequence where Kate, driven by a compounding accumulation of suspicion that has now crossed from unease into genuine investigative intent, makes a decision to look more closely at Esther's wrists. It happens at a moment when Esther is asleep, or appears to be asleep, which in this film amounts to the same thing as being fully awake and aware. Kate approaches carefully. The scene is filmed in near dark, with a quality of light that makes familiar spaces feel strange. The Coleman house rendered in the specific nighttime domesticity of hallways and door frames and the soft ambient glow of outdoor light through curtains. Kate reaches for Esther's wrist. She touches the ribbon, and in the half second before she can remove it, Esther's eyes open. Not dramatically, not with a horror movie startle, just open, present, fully. The transition from apparent sleep to absolute alertness is instantaneous in a way that no child sleeps. And what Esther does with those open eyes is the scene's real payload. She watches Kate with an expression that isn't fear, isn't surprise, isn't the confused grogginess of a woken child. It's a look of complete and settled awareness. I know what you are doing. I know what you are looking for. Try it if you want to. Kate retreats. She cannot frame what just happened as evidence. She cannot bring it to John and have it mean what it means. But she felt it, the specific species of fear that comes not from something jumping out at you, but from something looking at you from inside a space you believed was safe. The scene is maybe 90 seconds. It accomplishes more than some films manage in 20 minutes. John's breaking point. The midpoint crisis in John's arc arrives in a form that the film handles with uncomfortable specificity. Esther's campaign to attach John to herself has been patient and thorough. The paintings, the shared interests she discovered and cultivated, the quiet evenings in the study, the particular brand of daughterly warmth she dispenses with perfect calibration. But in Act 2's second half, the campaign escalates into territory. That is, frankly, the most genuinely disturbing element of the entire film's narrative. Esther attempts to seduce John. The film handles this with considerable care and restraint. We are never watching a scene of explicit content. The camera is disciplined throughout, and Colette Serra is clearly aware of the responsibility involved in depicting this material with a child actor in the role. What he does instead is stage the attempt through reaction, through John's face, through the abrupt and horrified comprehension that crosses his features, through the specific quality of his retreat from the room. You understand what Esther did through the impact it has on John, rather than through direct depiction of the act itself. But even in this careful handling, the scene lands with an extraordinary impact because it finally cracks John open. For the first time in the film, the comfortable narrative he's been maintaining, the narrative in which Kate is the unstable one and Esther is the innocent child requiring patience and protection, becomes impossible to sustain. Something real has collided with it, something that his body and his moral architecture both identify instantly and irrevocably as profoundly wrong. Sarsgaard plays the aftermath with a brittleness that reveals how much effort John has been expending in his performance of equanimity. He comes apart a little, not in a grand dramatic way, in the way of a man who has had a specific, necessary illusion stripped away and who doesn't yet know how to operate without it. He goes to Kate, and this is the film's great middle act pivot, the moment when John finally begins to hear what Kate has been saying. The problem with being believed too late. Kate's response to John finally coming to her side isn't the relief that narrative convention might suggest. Farmiga plays it as something more complicated than that. There's a brief flash of validation. Of course there is. She has been right and alone with being right for weeks, but underneath that flash is something that looks almost like dread. Because Kate has now reached the point in her understanding of Esther, where she knows that John's conversion to her position isn't sufficient protection. It's too late for the conventional solution, too late to simply remove Esther through proper channels. The institution that would receive her, the process that would manage the removal before something catastrophic happens. And Kate, who has been living inside the growing shape of the threat while John was outside it, understands something that John is only beginning to grasp. Esther will not accept removal without response. This is where the film shifts gears from psychological horror to something more kinetic. The second half of Act 2 begins the transition to the thriller mechanics that will define the final act. But before that transition fully completes, there are several beats that continue to work on the film's thematic level rather than its plot momentum level. DR, Browning and the D-therapy sessions. Margot Martindale gets fewer scenes than her ability warrants, but the scenes she has are doing structural work that the film needs. Dr. Browning represents the failure of legitimate institutional support, not through malice, not through incompetence, but through the specific limitations of what therapy can actually see from outside a family system. She knows Kate's history. She can observe Kate's affect. She can track Kate's progress and setbacks along the axes she has access to. What she cannot do is see into the Coleman house. She cannot weigh Kate's concerns against independent evidence. She has necessarily a frame constructed from Kate's documented history, and every unusual thing Kate reports gets processed through that frame. Martindale plays Browning with a genuinely kind attentiveness that makes the structural failure more poignant rather than less. This isn't a negligent therapist. This is a careful, concerned professional whose tools are not equipped for the specific situation her patient is actually in. The sessions are filmed with a warm, slightly claustrophobic intimacy. The soft-furnished office, the therapeutic distance managed correctly, the careful pauses. They're exactly what good therapy looks like, and they're useless. This is the film's subtler commentary on the systems we construct to manage mental health and family welfare. They are built for identifiable, categorizable problems. Lena Tlauvert doesn't fit the categories. She is something for which the categories don't yet have a slot. And in the gap between what the categories can accommodate and what is actually happening in that house, the Coleman family has been operating with no net beneath them. The investigation takes shape, Kate, now without the support of therapy, without the credibility capital of conventional validation, and with John only partially and recently converted to belief, takes matters into her own hands. The investigation sequence, Kate researching, making calls, following the thread of what Esther actually is one of the film's most satisfying structural sections because it shows us Kate at her most competent, not hysterical, not reactive, methodical. She uses what she has, an intelligence that the film has been quietly establishing throughout, a determination hardened by weeks of isolation, and the specific focused energy of someone who has finally stopped waiting for external validation and decided to find the answer herself. The trail leads backward, through the orphanage records, through the institutional history, through the specific documentation of Esther's previous placements. What Kate finds isn't the complete picture yet, that requires contact with the Sarne Institute itself, but what she finds is a pattern, Esther's previous families, the things that happened to them, the deaths that accumulated around her placements with a frequency that, once you're looking for it, is impossible to attribute to coincidence. Farmiga plays these discovery scenes with a very specific combination of horror and grim validation. This is what she feared. This is what she suspected. And the fact of being correct isn't relief. It's the cold specific weight of confirmed danger arriving in a form too large to manage calmly. The phone call to the Sarne Institute is the film's formal revelation scene, and it's staged with deceptive simplicity. Kate on the phone, a voice on the other end with a particular accent and a particular careful language. And then the information, there was no child named Esther at the Sarne Institute. There was a patient, a woman, and she's been missing for some time. And the photograph they can send, the photograph that will arrive and change every frame of the film Kate has been living in, will confirm what the voice is telling her. She has not been fighting a disturbed child. She has been fighting an adult who used the appearance of childhood as a weapon. Is there knows? There's a parallel track running through the investigation sequence that the film handles beautifully. In terms of dramatic irony, Esther is aware. Not precisely aware. She doesn't know Kate has called the institute, doesn't know what information is en route. But she has been monitoring the household's emotional temperature with the sensitivity of someone who has spent decades reading families. And she can feel the shift. John's behavior changed after the confrontation scene. He became subtly distant, watchful, different in the specific texture of his interaction with Esther. Kate's behavior has changed in the other direction. She became more focused, less reactive, the frantic edge replaced by something that Esther, with her extraordinary read of human behavior, would recognize as dangerous. The emotional landscape of the house has moved in a direction that Esther's control mechanisms are no longer fully managing. Fuhrman plays this awareness through the back half of Act 2 with beautiful, almost invisible specificity. Esther doesn't show alarm. Alarm would be the wrong note entirely. What she shows is heightened attention, a slightly tighter quality to her observational stillness. The sense of an operating system running diagnostics in the background of every interaction. She is still performing her roles with technical competence. Still the model child in the few external spaces she inhabits. Still calibrating her behavior at home to the specific requirements of each audience. But there's something underneath it now that wasn't there before. A pressure building. The machine is still running, but the machine has noticed that the ground beneath it is shifting. And when the photograph arrives, when Kate opens that email and sees the face she knows behind the face she was given, the machine is going to move to its final program. Act 2 is nearly done. The House of Lies is about to catch fire. Not metaphorically. The photograph changes everything. Not in the sense of the plot. The plot has been building toward this moment with methodical precision, but in the sense of the film's contract with its audience, until Kate opens that email and sees the institutional photograph of a 33-year-old woman with the exact features of the 9-year-old currently sleeping down the hall. Orphan has been operating in the register of psychological thriller. Unsettling, yes. Frightening, yes. But framed within the plausible, within the world of damaged children and fractured families and the particular horrors of domestic life under stress. The moment the photograph arrives, the film announces that it was always something else, something stranger, something that moves the genre coordinates entirely. And the extraordinary thing is, it works. It doesn't feel like a cheat. It doesn't feel like the film pulling a rabbit from a hat that wasn't established, because Colette Serra and Johnson planted the seeds with such thoroughness that the revelation functions as illumination rather than invention. Every strange detail coheres. Every uncomfortable moment finds its explanation. The film you thought you were watching was always this film. You just didn't have the right key. The photograph, Kate stares at the image for a long time. Farmiga doesn't play this moment with any of the operatic urgency that a lesser performance might reach for. She plays it with a very particular stillness. The stillness of someone whose nervous system is processing information too large and too strange to route through normal emotional channels. Her hand on the mouse, her eyes moving across the image, the specific quality of her breathing in the room's silence. What she is experiencing, and what Farmiga communicates with extraordinary precision, is the simultaneous arrival of two enormous feelings at once: the ice-cold horror of confirmed danger, and the vertiginous, almost surreal experience of having your entire perception of reality restructured in real time. She wasn't wrong. She was right. She was right in ways that went further and deeper than even her worst suspicions reached. Colette Serra gives this moment room. He doesn't cut away prematurely. He lets Farmiga hold the weight of the scene without assistance. No swelling score, no dramatic reaction shot from another character, no external signal telling the audience how to feel. Just Kate. The photograph. The specific, private reckoning of a woman who has just discovered that the threat in her home is something for which there is no protocol. She goes to find John. John and Kate together, finally. The conversation between John and Kate after the photograph's arrival is the film's emotional climax, separate from the action climax that follows, and in some ways more powerful. For the first time, they are genuinely on the same page. Not John performing belief while privately hedging, not Kate speaking to a man who's half listening through the filter of his own comfort. They are two people in the same room, both holding the same terrible truth, and the scene between them carries a raw, exhausted intimacy that Farmiga and Sarsgaard generate from the specific emotional chemistry of two people who have been misaligned for weeks, finally realigning under pressure. There's no triumph in it. That's what makes the scene work. There's no "I told you so." There's no vindication speech. There is just two adults in their kitchen in the middle of the night trying to figure out what you do when the impossible has turned out to be real and the impossible is currently asleep upstairs with your children. They make the decision to call the police. Of course they do. That's the rational response. It's also, as the film's final act will demonstrate, a response that Esther's program has a contingency for. Because Esther has been here before, she knows what happens when adults finally arrive at the truth. She has survived it before. And her survival strategy, when exposed, is not retreat, it's acceleration. The unraveling. Before John can complete the call, Esther acts. The transition from the relatively contained horror of the second act to the full kinetic brutality of Act 3's opening is one of the most effectively managed gear shifts in the film. Colette Serra doesn't build to it with elaborate warning. He just moves. A door, a corridor, the specific quality of nighttime silence in a house that is no longer safe. And then events begin cascading at a speed that the film has been deliberately withholding for two acts. What's crucial about this transition is that Esther's actions in the escalation sequence aren't panicked. They're urgent. Yes, she's moving faster than her usual methodical pace because the timeline has been compressed against her will. But the urgency has a quality of experienced crisis management rather than desperate improvisation. She has been here before. The exposure point. The moment when the family figures it out and the game changes. She knows exactly which pieces to move and in what order. She goes for the children first. Not to hurt them, not yet, not directly, but to reposition them. To remove Max from the equation of the adult's immediate action using the bond she spent weeks building for precisely this contingency. Max, who loves Esther with genuine, uncomplicated devotion, will respond to Esther's signal, will come, will be available as leverage. Daniel, who has always been the clearest danger to Esther's operation, represents a different calculation. Daniel is not manageable through the kind of emotional engineering that works on Max. Daniel sees. Daniel has always seen. And in the accelerating crisis of Act 3's opening, Daniel seeing becomes something that cannot be tolerated. What happens to Daniel? The attack on Daniel is the film's most viscerally upsetting sequence. Not because it is the most graphically violent thing in the movie, but because of who Daniel is and what it means. He is a 12-year-old kid who was right. He was right from the very beginning, right with the instinctive clarity that the adults around him were too socially conditioned to access. Right without the vocabulary to fully articulate it or the credibility infrastructure to make anyone listen. He paid for being right. He was isolated. He was dismissed. He was managed by Esther with the same cold precision she applied to every other obstacle. And now, in the film's third act, he faces the full consequence of being the person in the family whose eyes were opened the widest. The sequence is staged and shot with an urgency that breaks completely from the controlled deliberateness of the first two acts. Handheld work. Cuts that are faster and less clean, the specific visual register of crisis. Colette Serra isn't pretending this is composed. He is letting the frame become anxious. And the contrast between this visual chaos and the serene efficiency with which Esther moves through it makes her more frightening than anything the film has done with her up to this point. Jimmy Bennett's work in this sequence, the physical reality he brings to it, the specific scared kid quality of his performance under extreme narrative pressure is one of those child actor moments that should be remembered and isn't, simply because the film it lives in doesn't get the critical respect it deserves. Daniel survives. The film puts him in genuine danger without killing him, which is the right call. His survival is more affecting than his death would have been because it means the cost of being right is severe injury rather than consequence. Free heroism, and that is both more realistic and more thematically coherent. He is hurt badly, he lands in a hospital, he is removed from the final act's battlefield, which leaves Kate, John, and Max. The moment as there drops the performance. Completely, there's a scene late in Act 2's final push, just before the film fully transitions into its third act thriller mechanics, where Esther and Kate are alone, and the performance falls away entirely for the first time. Not the calculated partial reveal we saw in the kitchen scene, not the double-layered warning, all of it gone. What remains is Lena Cloward looking at Kate Coleman from inside Esther's face and the two women. Because that is what this scene is. Two women, regardless of the physical disparity between them, speak to each other with the direct hostility of people past the point of pretense. Fullman's entire physical register shifts for this scene. The calibrated, childlike quality of Esther's posture and movement gives way to something more settled and grounded. An adult's relationship to her own body, an adult stillness. The voice changes. Not dramatically, it's not a movie transformation moment with swelling music and theatrical revelation. It's subtler and therefore more disturbing, a slight lowering, a slight slowing, the removal of the specific vocal lightness that performed childhood. And what comes out of this phase that you have been watching for 2 hours is the clear, cold assessment of someone who has decided that the management phase is complete and the disposal phase has begun. The film earns this moment because it spent 2 acts building it with patience. You understand why Esther's facade drops here. She's been exposed, she's past the point where maintenance of the persona serves any strategic purpose, and perhaps, on some level, she's tired of it. Of the performance, of the endless calibration. There might be a complex strand of relief in the dropping of it if you're willing to extend Esther that much psychological interiority. The film is willing. It shows you a woman who is beneath the predation, beneath the cold efficiency, beneath the decades of manipulation, trapped, permanently, biologically, catastrophically trapped in the one form that ensures she will never be seen as what she is. That doesn't make her sympathetic. It makes her tragic in a way that doesn't diminish her danger. And it makes the final act's collision between her and Kate hit with a weight that goes beyond genre thriller mechanics into something more genuinely affecting. The architecture of the third act. Before we walk into the finale, let's take a breath and appreciate what the film has constructed. Orphan arrives at the end of its second act having completed several things simultaneously. It has sustained genuine psychological tension for roughly 90 minutes without relying primarily on shock effects. It has built 2 complete, 3-dimensional performances in Farmiga and Furman that go beyond the requirements of genre. It has embedded a family drama about grief, about communication failure, about the specific vulnerability of a couple still healing from loss inside its horror mechanics with enough integrity that the family story would be affecting even without the threat. And it has deployed its twist at a structural moment that maximizes impact late enough that the audience has had the full experience of the film before the frame shifts. Early enough that there's still an entire act remaining in which to explore the consequences of the revelation. The third act has one remaining job, to pay off everything the film has built without fumbling it. What follows is a chase, a siege, and a reckoning on a frozen lake in the kind of night that makes Connecticut feel like the edge of the world. Let's go see how it lands. Heather's final gambit. With Daniel in the hospital, John and Kate aware, and the police presumably en route, Esther's operational space has narrowed dramatically. The patient, methodical campaign that served her across the first 2 acts is no longer viable. She has one remaining asset, Max. The manipulation of Max in Act 3's opening is, in some ways, the most genuinely cold thing Esther does in the entire film, because it requires her to use the one relationship in the Coleman household that had something real in it. Whatever else Esther felt or didn't feel about the family, her relationship with Max occupied a different category. Not warmth exactly, though it may have resembled warmth more closely than her other relationships. But something, a particular attention, a specific investment that went slightly beyond pure strategic calculation. None of that stops her from using Max as a shield. She takes Max to the treehouse, a location she knows, has mapped, has presumably already considered as a potential redoubt during her installation phase. She positions Max between herself and the consequences arriving behind her, and she tells Max, in their shared private sign language, the language of genuine connection that she spent weeks earning, a version of events that frames the danger as coming from Kate rather than from herself. Max, who loves Esther and trusts her and is 8 years old, believes her. Engineers' work in these final sequences is heartbreaking precisely because Max's responses are all emotionally appropriate responses. Appropriate for a child who genuinely believes what she's been told, who is genuinely afraid, who is genuinely trying to protect someone she genuinely loves. The tragedy isn't that Max is foolish. It's that she is being exactly who she is, which is a child who trusts, and her trust is being used as a tactical instrument at the moment of maximum cynicism. The third act is minutes away from beginning in earnest. The house. the cold, the lake. Kate Coleman is about to find out what she is capable of. The final act of Orphan is where the film commits completely to its thriller mechanics, and where it earns the right to do so by never abandoning the emotional logic it spent 2 acts constructing. A lot of horror films make the mistake of treating their third act as a separate module. The scary part is over. Now, here's the action part. Now, here's the resolution part. The transitions between modes feel like gear changes you can feel in your teeth. What Orphan does instead is allow the third act to feel like the inevitable destination of everything that preceded it. The psychological dread, the domestic horror, the marital fracture, all of it arriving at a physical conclusion that mirrors and completes the emotional architecture. Kate doesn't fight Esther with a weapon she found convenient. She fights her with everything she is. A woman forged by loss, hardened by weeks of being dismissed, operating now on pure resourceful determination. The fight isn't incidental to the character. It is the character, expressed in physical terms. The night is cold. The house is large and dark in the way of houses at the edge of panic. And somewhere between the treehouse and the frozen pond at the property's edge, Orphan moves from a movie you admire to a movie that genuinely grips you by the collar. The treehouse. The treehouse sequence is where the film's most delicate structural tightrope gets walked. Esther has Max, and Kate must get Max back without triggering Esther into hurting her. The dynamic inverts everything that came before. For 2 acts, Esther held every tactical advantage. She had time, she had cover, she had the complicity of a family that didn't fully believe the truth yet. Now she has one child and a shrinking window. Kate, conversely, has been backed into a corner. And backed into a corner is where Farmiga shows you the dimension of Kate Coleman that the film has been quietly building toward all along. The Coleman house's exterior, that clean, expensive, magazine spread architecture that felt wrong from the first act, becomes actively hostile terrain in these sequences. Colette, Sarah films it with the spatial awareness that's been developing across the entire film. He knows every corner of this house. He knows where the light falls and where it doesn't, which sight lines are open and which are blocked, how far sound carries between the kitchen and the upper floor. All of that accumulated spatial intelligence gets deployed in the third act with the efficiency of someone spending a carefully saved resource. Kate moves through her house differently now. Not the tense, watchful movement of the second act, alert but constrained, always performing normalcy over the top of fear. She moves with a particular focus that strips away everything except the immediate task. Get to Max. Get Max safe. Whatever comes after that comes after that. And above her, in the treehouse, Esther is making her own calculation. J.O. John Coleman's death is the film's most morally complex moment, and it arrives with a swiftness that refuses to let you settle into it. Sarsgaard plays John's final scenes. His conversion to full belief, his attempt to act on it, his confrontation with the thing wearing his daughter's face, with a rawness that redeems everything that frustrated about his second act passivity. This is a man who held onto a false story past the point of evidence and is now paying the cost of that fidelity, and Sarsgaard doesn't pretend otherwise. He doesn't play John as a hero arriving to save the day. He plays him as a man arriving late to a fight he should have engaged weeks earlier, carrying the specific weight of that lateness. The confrontation between John and Esther in the final act is staged without the careful formal restraint of the film's earlier scenes. Colette, Sarah allows it to be messy and physical and desperate in the way that real violence, as opposed to choreographed violence, tends to be. And in the midst of the mess, Esther operates with her characteristic efficiency. No rage, no visible emotion. Just the settled, horrible competence of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what a human body requires to stop working. John's death doesn't land as a conventional plot development. It lands as a consequence. The specific consequence of a specific pattern of choices, of choosing comfort over clarity, of hearing Kate's warnings through the filter of his preferred narrative rather than on their own terms. That is not a moral judgment on John as a person. The film is not that simplistic, and Sarsgaard is not playing a cartoon. It is simply the shape of what the story required. And in the economy of the film's emotional logic, his death reframes everything, because it leaves Kate entirely alone. No husband, no support, no external resource, just a woman and the thing she has to stop. K.A. alone. There is a specific dramatic tradition, classical actually, of the protagonist being stripped of every ally and resource before the final confrontation. It's the structure that ensures the climax feels genuinely earned rather than manufactured, because when you've removed every safety net, when the character standing in the frame has nothing left but herself, the outcome depends entirely on what that self is actually made of. Orphan executes this structure with precision. By the time Kate faces Esther in the film's final sequence, she has lost Daniel to injury, lost John to death, lost external credibility through most of the film, and lost every conventional avenue of rescue. The police are coming. She knows this. The film knows this. But the police are not here. Kate is here. And Esther is here. And between them is Max, who still loves Esther and is standing between them in the most literal possible sense. Farmiga's physical performance in these final sequences is the aspect of her work in this film that gets least discussed and most deserves examination. Horror heroines are often assessed on their screaming, their running, their reactive capacity. Farmiga does something different. She plays Kate's physicality in the third act as a woman operating in a dissociated state, past fear in the specific way that extreme crisis can move you, past fear into something quieter and more functional. She is not hysterical, she is not trembling, she is solving a problem, and the problem has a body, and she needs to solve it before Max gets hurt. The Frozen Pond. The film's climax takes place on the frozen pond at the edge of the Coleman property, and it is one of the more genuinely well-crafted action sequences in mainstream horror of its era, not because it's spectacular, but because it's merciless. The geography of the sequence is established clearly. The pond, the ice, the night sky above it that makes the space feel enormous and isolated and completely without witnesses. Colette Serra stages it with a spatial clarity that keeps you oriented even as the action escalates. You always know where Katie is, where Esther is, where Max is, and the distances between them. This sounds like basic filmmaking, but it isn't. In the heightened chaos of a horror climax, spatial incoherence is the easiest trap to fall into and the most effective way to drain tension rather than build it. Esther, moving across the ice toward Max, is dressed in the same formal, ribbon-adorned outfit she has worn throughout the film. It's a deliberate costume choice that carries enormous visual weight in this sequence. The ribbons, those ribbons catch the ambient light. The old-fashioned dress moves strangely against the ice and the night. She looks, in this moment, precisely like something from a different century, a different world, something that has no business being in this contemporary suburban Connecticut landscape. It's the film's most gothic visual moment, and it earns it because everything leading to it has been grounded in the recognizable. Kate comes after her. What follows is a fight that the film refuses to aestheticize. It's cold and desperate and physically real in the way that the film's violence has always been. Unglamorous, costly, determined by weight and leverage and the specific brutal physics of two people on ice at night. Esther, despite her adult psychology and her decades of operational experience, is housed in the body of a child. Kate is an adult woman operating on maternal adrenaline and 12 weeks of compressed rage. The physical disparity matters. The film doesn't pretend otherwise. I am not your fucking mother. There is a line in the final sequence of Orphan that has lodged in the cultural memory of anyone who's seen the film, and it deserves a moment. When Esther, in the final confrontation, drops the performance entirely and speaks to Kate as Lena. With the specific adult register we heard briefly in Act 2's revelation scene, the accent and cadence of the woman rather than the child. She makes a plea that is, in its own way, the saddest thing in the film. She wants what she has always wanted. She wants to be seen as a woman. She wants the thing that her biology permanently denied her: recognition, adult relationship, love on adult terms. She chose the wrong form for it. She has spent her entire life choosing the wrong form for it. The tragedy of Lena Cloward is that every attempt to claim what she needed took the shape of predation rather than petition, because predation was the only language available to her, the only tool her experience had provided. She cannot ask. She has never been able to ask. She can only take Kate's response. Raw, final, delivered from the specific emotional location of a woman who has lost her husband and nearly lost her children in the previous hour, contains multitudes. It is the refusal of sympathy. It is the refusal of the victim role. It is Kate Coleman asserting, in the most compressed possible form, the boundary of what this situation is and what it is not. It will not be reframed as misunderstanding. It will not be softened into tragedy. It is what it is. Farmiga delivers it with a clarity that lands like a door closing. The ice breaks. The final resolution, Esther's death in the pond, the ice giving way beneath them both, Kate hauling herself out while Esther cannot, is handled with that same refusal of aestheticization that defines the film's approach to violence throughout. There is a moment, in the water, where Esther looks at Kate with an expression that Furman holds for a fraction of a second before the film cuts away. What's in that expression is the subject of some debate among people who've analyzed this film closely. Disbelief, possibly. The specific shock of a person who has survived every previous exposure point, discovering that this one is different. Rage, certainly, underneath. But underneath the rage, if you're willing to look, something that might, in another life, in another form, have been grief. Lena Cloward wanted to be loved. She went about it in ways that made love impossible. And in the cold water of a Connecticut pond, in the body of a 9-year-old girl, a 33-year-old woman discovers that the form she inhabited so completely that nobody could see through it has become, at the last, the thing that kills her. The child's body, that was her greatest weapon, is the thing that cannot fight its way out of the ice. The camera pulls back. The pond. The night sky. Kate on the ice with Max. It's over. The aftermath often ends without a conventional resolution scene. No extended denouement, no hospital bedside reconciliation, no scene of the family beginning to rebuild. The film ends at the pond, in the cold, with Kate and Max alive, and the rest of the night still spread out around them. This is exactly the right call. A resolution scene would be dishonest. What would you show? The Coleman family, minus a husband, minus the illusion of the adoption working, plus a trail of institutional bodies and a story that no conventional framework is going to be able to adequately process, does not have a resolution available to it. What Kate and Max have is survival. That is enough. The film closes on survival and allows everything else, the grief, the legal aftermath, the long work of rebuilding a life, to exist in the space outside the frame. Max, shivering in Kate's arms on the ice, is the film's final image of something real. After 2 hours of performance and manipulation and the systematic corruption of genuine feeling, here is something that was always genuine. A small child's need for her mother, Kate's ferocious, absolute refusal to let that need go unmet. No twist, no sting, no sequel setup, just that. The third act of Orphan lands because it was assembled carefully across the entire film that preceded it. The action sequences work because the emotional investments are real. The climax lands because the characters are three-dimensional enough that you care who walks away from it. And the ending resonates because it earns its restraint. It doesn't offer comfort. It hasn't paid for. What we haven't done yet is examine how the film was constructed at the technical level, the specific visual language Colette Serra built, the sound design architecture that was quietly doing half the film's horror work, the editing rhythms that kept 2.5 hours of content from ever feeling slack. That's where we are going next. Every horror film is, at its foundation, an argument about what the camera should be doing. Some argue for found footage claustrophobia. Some argue for wide lens maximalism. Some argue for darkness, for gore, for the aesthetics of rot and decay. Often makes a different argument entirely, one that most analyses of the film either skip past or mention briefly without fully examining. Orphan argues that the most effective visual register for this specific story is beauty. Not horror-tinged beauty, not the gothic grandeur of classical horror aesthetics, all fog and ruined architecture. Clean, cold, contemporary beauty, the kind associated with shelter magazines and real estate listings and the aspirational imagery of upper-middle-class American domestic life. The Coleman house is gorgeous. Shot by cinematographer Jeff Cutter, it is rendered throughout the film with a precision and warmth that belongs to a lifestyle film rather than a horror film. The kitchen surfaces are immaculate. The light through the large windows is the soft, directional light of a winter afternoon that a production designer would dream about. The children's rooms are warm and carefully considered. The study where John and Esther do their painting sessions glows with the amber light of genuine domestic comfort. This is a deliberate and sophisticated choice, because the horror of the film isn't the ugliness of the world it depicts, it's the corruption of beauty. The thing that makes Esther's presence so unsettling isn't that she arrives in a dark and damaged place. It's that she arrives in a place that is trying to be good, a family that is trying to love, a house that is trying to be a home, a marriage that is trying to recover from grief. The visual warmth of the film's environment makes the wrongness inside it more disturbing, not less, because the wrongness has nowhere to hide in all that light and cleanliness and architectural intention. And yet, it hides perfectly. Jeff Cutter's lens strategy. Cutter's cinematography operates through a set of lens and framing choices that are consistent enough to read as a system rather than a collection of individual decisions. The most important of these is the focal length strategy he uses for Esther specifically. Throughout the film, when Esther is the primary subject of a shot, Cutter tends toward longer focal lengths. Not extreme telephoto, but longer than the natural, slightly wide perspective used for family scenes and domestic interaction. What this does, subtly and continuously, is compress the spatial relationship between Esther and her surroundings. The background comes slightly closer. The sense of her being embedded in a three-dimensional environment, of existing in normal space, in normal proportion to the world, is slightly undermined. She looks in a way that is never dramatic enough to consciously notice on a first viewing, like a figure in a photograph rather than a person in a room. Hold that thought against the revelation. A woman in a child's body, a person who doesn't naturally fit the spatial dimensions of the world she is operating in. Cutter was building a visual argument for the film's central premise, that Esther occupies her environment differently than the people around her, long before the script delivers it explicitly. The contrast shots, when Cutter does use a wider perspective for Esther, are reserved for specific moments of vulnerability or calculation. The orphanage introduction, where she is seen from the Coleman's perspective before we've had time to develop our own visual relationship with her, is shot slightly wide. She looks small. She looks like a child in a room full of children. It's the establishing shot of the illusion. Everything after is the maintenance of it, built frame by frame with cutters, deliberate lens choices, creating a visual texture that your eye registers without your brain processing it consciously. Color and light. The film's color palette shifts across its three acts in a way that maps precisely onto its tonal movement. Act 1. The establishment of the Coleman world and Esther's integration uses the warm amber and soft natural light we discussed. The palette feels lived in and genuine. Even the orphanage, which you might expect to be rendered in institutional cold light, is shot with a warmth that makes it feel like a legitimate place rather than a horror environment. Colette, Sarah doesn't want you afraid of the orphanage. He wants you to understand why the Colemans would feel comfortable there. The second act introduces a creeping desaturation. Not dramatic, not the aggressive grey blue of prestige drama or the washed out pallor of torture, porn horror. Subtle. The warm light begins to have a slightly harder, cooler quality. The skin tones in the Coleman household scenes lose a fraction of their richness. The house, which felt warm and aspirational in Act 1, begins to feel slightly more clinical, more like a stage set, more like the surfaces are just surfaces and the warmth was always lighting rather than life. By Act 3, particularly in the treehouse and frozen pond sequences, the palette has moved into genuine winter severity, the specific, beautiful bleakness of a New England night in deep cold, all blue-gray and silver, and the absence of warmth. It's gorgeous filmmaking, and it's emotionally precise. By the time we reach the ice, every frame of warmth the film built in Act 1 has been systematically removed. The house of beauty that the Colemans inhabited is gone. What remains is cold and clear and real. This progression didn't happen by accident. It required intentional collaboration between Cutter, Colette Serra, and the production design team, lighting decisions made for Act 3, needing to cohere with choices made for Act 1. The whole system designed as a visual arc rather than a set of independent scenes. Production design. The house as character production designer. Andrew Munro deserves specific credit for a contribution that the film's marketing never highlighted and that almost no analysis mentions by name. The Coleman house functions as a character in this film, not in the loose metaphorical sense that critics often use to praise notable production design, but in a specific structural sense, the house changes, or more precisely, your relationship to the house changes across the film's runtime, and that change is engineered through deliberate design choices rather than through what happens in its rooms. The house is beautiful and it is cold. Not temperature, cold, emotionally cold. The clean lines and expensive surfaces and the careful, considered aesthetic of the interiors are the design of a couple who have money and taste but haven't fully inhabited their own space. The house looks like it belongs in a magazine spread because it was designed by people performing the idea of home rather than people who have arrived at one. There are spaces in it that feel unlived, in rooms with the pristine quality of carefully maintained surfaces rather than the comfortable disorder of genuine use. This is a home that is still, in some way, aspirational. Still the house the Colemans are trying to become the people who belong in it. And Esther, who reads environments with the specific eye of someone who has inhabited many of them strategically, finds this quality and uses it. She moves through the Coleman house with an ownership that the Colemans themselves never quite project. She sits in the center of rooms, she occupies furniture as though it belongs to her. She reads the spatial language of the house and reflects it back in a way that subtly positions her as more truly at home in it than its actual owners. The treehouse, by contrast, is a different kind of space entirely rougher, more provisional, built at the edge of the property where the manicured aesthetic of the house doesn't reach. It's appropriate that Esther retreats there when her position in the main house becomes untenable. It's a space outside the performance, outside the domesticated beauty of the Coleman's constructed life. So undesigned. And John Ottman's score, the sound architecture of Orphan, is one of its most underappreciated technical achievements, and it deserves extended examination because it's doing work that the visual language alone couldn't accomplish. Composer John Ottman, who also served as editor, a dual role he's occupied on numerous films and which produces a specific and useful integration of rhythm and score, constructed a musical vocabulary for the film that operates on two distinct registers simultaneously. The first register is the Coleman family's emotional world. Ottman uses strings with a particular warmth and intimacy, not the full lushness of a conventional dramatic score, but a restrained, slightly attenuated stringed writing that sounds like genuine feeling with something missing from it, a family doing its best under difficulty. The music tells you this. It's not sentimental. There's a careful avoidance of the manipulative sentimentality that a lesser composer might have reached for in the adoption and integration scenes, but it's genuinely warm. You feel the Colemans trying. The second register is Esther's world, and here Ottman does something genuinely clever. He doesn't give Esther her own theme in the conventional horror sense. No shrieking strings, no low-end menace, no obvious monster motif. Instead, the music around Esther is characterized primarily by what it withholds. When Esther enters a scene, the warmth of the Coleman musical language doesn't simply stop, it continues, but something is removed from it. a frequency, a completeness. The strings continue, but they are slightly thinner, slightly more exposed, slightly more mechanical, like warmth being performed rather than felt. This is called horror at its most sophisticated. The audience doesn't consciously register the change, but their nervous systems do. You feel slightly more alone in scenes that center Esther. The musical environment becomes slightly less inhabited. And because the change is gradual and subtractive rather than dramatic and additive, it bypasses your analytical brain and goes straight to the body. The silence strategy. Beyond the score, the film's use of silence is one of Colette Serra's most effective tools and one of the more distinctive choices in the sound design overall. The Coleman house is, when the score retreats, an extremely quiet house. The ambient sound design, the specific acoustic signature of a large, well-insulated contemporary house in winter, is established carefully in the film's opening sections and then deployed strategically throughout. When the house is quiet in Orphan, it's the specific quiet of a space that is holding something in. It has a slightly pressurized quality, like the silence before a change in atmospheric pressure. Colette Serra withholds the score entirely for several key scenes, most notably several of the direct Esther-Kate confrontations. No music, just the ambient acoustic of the space, the specific sounds of breathing and fabric, and the barely audible hum of the house's systems. This creates a different kind of unease than horror stings or musical tension. It creates the kind of unease that comes from being very alert in a very quiet place. Your own listening becomes part of the experience. The scenes between Max and Esther in their private sign language communication are handled with a sound design choice that is, on reflection, extraordinary. When the film is in their space, it reduces ambient sound to near nothing, not silence, but a deep quiet in which you become aware of the absence of verbal communication in the scene. The film is making you experience, very briefly, something close to what Max experiences as her primary communicative mode. It creates an intimacy with Max that the dialogue-heavy scenes between adult characters can't achieve, and it makes the moments when Esther corrupts that intimacy feel like a specifically personal violation. I think RH Hydemes. Ottman's editorial work deserves its own examination, distinct from his scoring work, because the film's pacing is one of its defining achievements. Orphan runs 123 minutes. For a mainstream horror thriller aimed at a broad audience, that's a considerable runtime. Most studio horror of this era ran 90.100 minutes. The decision to allow the film this length was a production-level bet on the audience's willingness to stay with a story that prioritizes psychological development over shock rate efficiency. It was, given the box office, the right bet. But the film doesn't feel 23 minutes. It feels lean. And the reason it feels lean, despite the extensive character development, despite the extended Act 2 psychological section, despite the deliberate pacing of revelations, is the specific quality of Ottman's cuts. He cuts on intention rather than on action. The conventional editorial approach to thriller sequences is to cut on physical movement, bodies moving, doors opening, the trigger events of physical action. Ottman consistently cuts a beat earlier, on the decision or the realization that precedes the action. The effect is that the audience is continuously slightly ahead of the cut. Your eye and brain have already processed what's going to happen, and the cut meets you there rather than leading you. This creates a specific, almost subconscious sense of momentum. The film isn't waiting for you, you're keeping pace with it. And keeping pace with something creates an engagement that simply watching something does not. In the third act, the editing quickens. The cuts become faster, less settled, the frames less resolved before they give way to the next image. But this acceleration feels earned rather than imposed because Ottman has been building toward it across a film that was always moving at exactly the right speed for the narrative stage it was in. The technical craft of Orphan, the cinematography, the production design, the sound architecture, the editorial intelligence represents a level of filmmaking discipline that the film's genre classification tends to obscure. This is not a technically careless movie. Every department was working with genuine rigor toward a shared tonal and narrative vision, and the coherence of the result is the direct product of that integration. What we haven't fully reckoned with is the center of the entire enterprise, the element that, if it fails, makes every other craft decision irrelevant. Isabelle Fuhrman. And what she actually does in this film? Let's establish the baseline immediately, because the stakes here are higher than in most performance analyses. If Isabelle Fuhrman's performance as Esther doesn't work, if it slips at any point into parody, into the conventional register of movie evil child, into the kind of performative creepiness that horror audiences have learned to read as genre shorthand, then Orphan collapses entirely, not just the horror elements. The whole thing, the psychological architecture, the marital drama, the thematic layers about credibility and grief, and the weaponization of innocence, all of it requires a center that holds with absolute conviction. You need to believe simultaneously in Esther the child and Lena beneath the child, in the performance and the performer behind the performance, and you need both layers to be genuinely, frighteningly convincing. Fuhrman was 12 years old. She had appeared previously in small roles. A minor part in Orphan was actually not her feature debut, but nothing that suggested what she was about to do in this film. The performance she delivers is not a precocious child actor performance in the way we've been trained to recognize them, technically accomplished, emotionally demonstrative, working slightly too hard to prove the craft. It's something considerably stranger and more impressive. It's a performance that has interior weight, that feels inhabited from the inside rather than constructed from the outside. The dual architecture. The core technical challenge of playing Esther, which we've described from the narrative angle but need to examine from the performance angle, is the management of two simultaneous characters across a 2-hour film. Character 1, Esther Coleman, the recently adopted Russian-American child, precocious and slightly formal, wounded in ways that explain her unusual behavior, fundamentally harmless if unusual. This is the character the Coleman family and external world sees. Character 2, Lena Clavert, adult woman, institutionalized and dangerous, operating with decades of psychological sophistication behind a biological facade she cannot remove. This is the character the audience sees glimpses of and finally sees fully across the film's runtime. Most actors, when they play a character concealing another character, work by performing the concealment, by playing the surface character and indicating the hidden one through strategic cracks in the surface. This is the technical approach that most training systems would suggest. Show the mask. Occasionally show what's behind the mask. Manage the transitions between visibility states. What Fuhrman does is different, and it's the reason the performance feels uncanny rather than clever. She doesn't play the concealment. She plays Lena, playing Esther. The distinction sounds philosophical, but it's viscerally experiential on screen. The specific quality of Esther's composure, the way she holds herself, the calibration of her social performances, the particular alertness behind her eyes, even in the most apparently relaxed moments. All of these carry the behavioral signature of an adult rather than a child. Not because Fuhrman is trying to look adult. She isn't. She's trying to look like a child. But because the character she is playing is an adult who is trying to look like a child. The authenticity is in the performance, within the performance. Esther is real. Lena's performance of Esther is real. And both levels of reality are present simultaneously. The eyes. If you've seen Orphan, you know what I'm talking about before I say it. Fuhrman's eyes in this film are doing more work than most actors' entire bodies. There's a specific quality to how she uses them, a stillness, an attention, a quality of intake that reads as cognitively different from how a child uses their eyes. Children's eyes move with a specific frequency and pattern of focus, distracted, returning, interested in peripheral motion, susceptible to novelty. Fuhrman's eyes in this role have a different temporal rhythm. They settle, they fix, they process with an unhurried thoroughness that belongs to someone who has the patience of long experience. This is not a note any director could give. This is an intuition Fuhrman arrived at from inside the character. In interviews around the film's release, she described her approach to Esther in terms of understanding what Esther needs, positioning the character's psychology in a motivational frame rather than a behavioral one. She wasn't asking, how does a villain look? She was asking, what does Lena want in this scene? And the behavioral specificity, including those extraordinary eyes, flowed from the answer. The practical effect is that you feel watched by Esther in scenes where she is nominally passive, sitting at a dinner table, observing an adult conversation, standing in a doorway. The camera catches Fuhrman in a mode of attention that makes the back of your neck prickle. She is always gathering, always processing, always somewhere ahead of the social moment she is apparently inhabiting. Children look at the world with presence. Esther looks at it with assessment. And that distinction, held consistently across 123 minutes, is one of the most impressive single-note performances I can think of in the horror genre. The transition moments, the scenes where Esther shifts registers, where the Lena beneath the Esther surface becomes visible, represent the film's highest degree performance challenges, and there where Fuhrman's work peaks. The partial drop scene in the kitchen, which we examine from a narrative angle in Act 2, is worth returning to from a performance perspective. The transition Fuhrman makes is accomplished without any of the theatrical mechanisms that conventional acting might employ. No voice drop, no sudden cold stare, no visible effort of character shift. What changes is something in the relationship between the face and what's behind it. The social management layer, the specific gentle focus that Esther deploys in interactions where she needs to be read as a child, simply recedes. What remains is unmediated. The Lena quality of the attention, the adult steadiness of the gaze, the absence of the practiced vulnerability, and then, just as fluidly, it returns. Esther asks for milk, the layer reinstates. The child is back. The layer reinstates. The child is back. The speed of that reinstatement is, in some ways, the most frightening element of the scene. It tells you that the switching cost is negligible, that the performance is so deeply installed it can be resumed instantaneously, that there is no seam. The full drop. The confrontation scene where Lena speaks to Kate directly, without the frame of Esther, required Fuhrman to access something considerably more demanding. Playing a child pretending to be a child is one thing. Playing an adult woman trapped in a child's body in the moment when the decades of performed childhood finally give way to genuine, desperate adult affect. That is a performance demand that would challenge any actor. Fuhrman reaches it. The vocal quality in that scene, the specific weight and register of the words, the physical presence. Something arises in that scene that wasn't present in any of the Esther sequences, and the contrast makes both versions more powerful by context, preparation, and call it. Sarah's direction. How much of what Fuhrman achieves was her own intuitive work, and how much was Colette Sarah's direction? Impossible to fully separate, and probably the wrong question. Great performances are always a collaborative product. What is documented is that Colette Sarah took the preparation process for the younger cast seriously in ways that went beyond standard child actor protocols. He was reportedly careful to maintain emotional separation between Fuhrman and the darker material in the script, explaining scenes in terms of their craft and function rather than their emotional content, protecting her from having to fully inhabit the psychological weight of Lena's history and damage. The specific technique of approaching Esther's behavior from the outside, from observable behavioral choices rather than full emotional identification, may actually have served the performance better than a more immersive approach would have. Fuhrman wasn't processing childhood trauma, she was building a precise behavioral architecture from the outside in, which produced, paradoxically, something that feels more genuine than manufactured empathy often does. The practical effect of this approach is evident in the consistency of the performance across the film's range of tonal registers. Fuhrman doesn't work harder in the scariest scenes. She doesn't visibly access emotion in the more vulnerable ones. She maintains the character at a stable operational temperature throughout, which is exactly right, because Esther's psychological signature is precisely that stability. The lack of a normal emotional range isn't something Esther displays. It's something she has spent decades learning to conceal. Fuhrman understands this distinction and plays from inside it. Farmiga and Fuhrman, the central dynamic. The film is fundamentally a two-hander, and the relationship between Farmiga and Fuhrman on screen and, one imagines, in the working environment of the production is where Orphan's sustained power lives. They are playing characters in absolute opposition. A woman who is genuinely trying to love a child, and a woman who is using the appearance of childhood to exploit that attempt at love. The emotional charge of their scenes comes precisely from this opposition. From the specific way genuine feeling and weaponized performance interact when they are in the same frame. Farmiga brings the full weight of her dramatic craft to Kate's reality, the grief, the effort, the specific exhaustion of a woman fighting alone. And Fuhrman brings the full weight of her character's constructed reality, the calibration, the management, the specific coldness that passes for warmth until the light changes. In the scenes where Kate reaches toward Esther, attempts warmth, attempts connection, extends the specific vulnerability of someone who wants this to work. And Esther receives it with that practiced careful reserve. Farmiga and Fuhrman create something that cuts deeper than conventional horror. They create the specific sadness of genuine love being received by something that cannot use it. Kate's attempts at mothering Esther are real. They are real acts of human generosity extended towards something that experiences them as operational data. That gap between what Kate offers and what Esther does with it is the emotional wound at the center of the film. Farmiga has spoken about her working relationship with Fuhrman in terms of genuine mutual